Great to be here. I'm really excited to be able to share this work on school safety in Detroit with you. Now, as you might be aware, over the past 25 years with the charter school movement, there's been an incredible amount of research out there looking at charter schools and student achievement. What I look at are some of the non-tested measures of performance for charter schools. So things like student safety, parental involvement, other life outcomes, university completion, income, and those sorts of things. So the study that I'm presenting here today, are charter schools safer in deindustrialized cities with high rates of crime? It comes out of my dissertation work. So it's part of a series of 4 studies that I did. 2 are qualitative and 2 were quantitative. And this overall body of research suggests that charter schools offer an improvement on safety, but may not serve the most vulnerable or the most highly disadvantaged students in a really challenging context like Detroit. Okay, so here's a roadmap for the presentation. I'm just going to begin with a little bit of background about the charter school movement, talk a little bit about the study setting, Detroit, and then talk a little bit about my methods, so the different data sources that I brought together for the analyses in this study, present my results, and then talk about some of the key limitations of the results in this study that I did and how they might be addressed in future work. Okay, just to orient the presentation, so what is a charter school? Essentially, a charter school is a publicly funded school that typically operates outside of the central school district authority. And since the first charter school laws started getting passed in the early 90s, charter schools have really advanced at a rapid rate throughout the United States. So today, you have about 3 million students enrolled in about 7,000 charter schools across 43 states. So it's about between almost 7% of all public school enrollments are charter school students, or students currently enrolled in charter schools. So charter schools in deindustrialized cities. So deindustrialized cities, places like Cleveland, Detroit, Flint, Camden, Gary, Indiana, have really been ground zero for charter school reforms. So in a lot of these, in a lot of these cities and in the school districts, you have between 30 and 50% of all students enrolled in charter schools. So very high proportion of students in charter schools in these types of cities. And these cities have really come to signify industrial decline, population loss, and urban decay that's really occurred over the past half century in cities that once had quite prosperous manufacturing centers. And today, a lot of these cities are plagued with a set of problems. So they tend to experience high rates of crime, concentrated poverty, and a number of other different social problems that can shape the context for public education in these cities. And so schools really haven't been immune to a lot of the social and economic declines that you've seen in a lot of these cities. So they've experienced very, very low rates of student achievement for a very long time, low rates of educational attainment. Students routinely report high rates of victimization and violence in schools in these cities. And there's really been widespread discontent in the school community with these schools, among parents in particular, with some people claiming that the public education system in these cities has failed students that are most in need of a really high quality education. And so school safety has been one of the long-standing pressing concerns in a lot of these cities in places like Detroit. And as charter schools have come into these cities, they've been touted as a way to provide safer schools, but there's been very little research that's actually investigated whether charter schools are actually safer than their public school peers. So a little bit about the study setting. So Detroit, Michigan. Detroit is really emblematic of the historical, the social, and the economic realities of deindustrialized cities. So in the 1950s, it was one of the wealthiest cities in the US, very strong middle class, thriving manufacturing center. Then in the 1950s, it started to experience pretty steady industrial decline. And this resulted in rising unemployment, increases in crime, increases in poverty, vast number of social problems, white flight to the suburbs. The population dropped from about 2 million in the 1950s to under 700,000 today. So in the 1950s, you also had about 350,000 students in the public schools within Detroit. Today it's under 100,000. So big declines in those areas. And today the city has become really one of the poorest in the United States. It faces substantial crime, a great deal of urban decay, and very high rates of concentrated poverty. Detroit has also been at the forefront of the charter school movement since about the early and mid-90s, when charter schools have really advanced across the city at a rapid rate. And you have nearly half of all students in Detroit now enrolled in charter schools. So a big percentage of students enrolled in charter schools in Detroit. And both the public and the charter school sectors serve a high proportion of low-income African American students. Now, as you might be aware, as you go across states, different state laws can shape the configurations of charter schools. So, for example, I was talking last week with the former Secretary of Education in New Mexico, and she said that in her state, all of the charter schools were so-called freestanding or boutique charter schools, or charter schools that don't contract with a management organization in any way. So they run operations all on their own. Now, that's quite different from what you find in Michigan, where nearly every charter school contracts with a management organization. Now, if you just kind of look at Chicago, so maybe some of you have come across charters here in Chicago. So there are some similarities here. You'll notice here, point number 2, for-profit educational management organizations, much more common in Detroit. So they operate about half of all charter schools in Detroit. You have a pretty similar number of schools in Detroit and Chicago, but of course, much higher percentage of students enrolled in charters in Detroit, about half all students, compared to 14%, just 14% in Chicago. So safety seeking is actually really important to understanding school choice processes in Detroit. It was a few years back, Detroit was one of 5 cities to receive funding from the U.S. Department's Youth Violence Prevention Initiative. And so in receiving funding through this program, the city, one of the things it did was conduct a survey of Detroit's youth, and it found that 87% had had a friend or relative shot, murdered, or disabled by violence in a 12-month period. 55% of Detroit's high school students reported being a victim of violence in a 12-month period. So students really reporting being exposed to very high rates of violence. A great deal of research suggesting that they're exposed to violence both in and out of school. And so as you might imagine, when parents report seeking out a charter school, they report safety as one of the primary reasons why they go out and seek out a charter school in Detroit. Now, for their part, the charter schools tend to market themselves as being safer in their promotional materials. It seems to be a strategy that they use to try to attract families. There's not a lot of research out there, though, that actually has looked into what they might be actually doing to try to increase school safety. And Detroit Public Schools, that's the traditional school district, has also taken steps in recent years to try to improve safety. So they've instituted violence prevention programs, some restorative justice programs, and they've also focused quite a bit on some of the harder measures of security, so stepping up police patrols, use of metal detectors, video surveillance, physical barriers. These sorts of things have increased quite a bit in the past few years in Detroit. Now, why do advocates of charter schools hypothesize that they'll be safer? Well, one mechanism is competition. So advocates of charter schools claim that because of competitive forces, in order to attract families to the school, charter schools are going to have to be responsive to local demands for safer schools. And so this is one mechanism. Another mechanism is operating outside of the central school district will, in theory, allow charter schools to be more flexible, to be more nimble, to develop innovative safety strategies that improve safety in the learning environment. And then finally, hypothetically, then regulators will hold charter schools accountable for providing safer schools or close them down. And so these are some of the theoretical claims of advocates that advocates put forward for school choice. Now, as I mentioned, there's been very few studies looking at school safety in some of the more challenging cities like Detroit. A few studies seem to suggest that charter schools might be safer because they have really orderly learning environments or strict learning environments, or that they may take more community-centered approaches, develop better relationships with families and students, and these sorts of things. But this really hasn't been looked at quantitatively very much. There are some descriptive studies out there. So there's one national level study that takes the schools and staffing survey, which is filled out by principals. So essentially, principals will give their self-reports of safety in the schools. And so this study that looked at these national level data found that principals in charter schools report fewer safety incidents relative to public schools. There was also another survey that was done many years back that also found that there are fewer, that there's higher reported safety in charter schools. And then there's another very recent descriptive study that came out that looked at student self-reports of safety and just kind of compared public and charter schools descriptively and found that charter schools were reported to be safer. But while these are useful studies, one of the main problems is that these descriptive studies leave out controls that may enable a more valid comparison between charter and public schools. So they don't have controls for things like student demographics. They don't have controls for neighborhood crime or maybe levels of urban decay in a neighborhood. And they don't take into account the potential for self-selection bias. So let me just take a quick sip here. I'm a little parched. So why might these controls matter? Well, it may simply be the case that charter schools disproportionately take in students with a higher sociodemographic profile. And so that what you're seeing when you're looking at the descriptive difference in safety, what you're actually seeing is just a difference in the type of students that charter schools take in. And it may also have to do with certain neighborhood characteristics. So there's a very large literature out there that suggests that things like neighborhood crime can be very influential for school safety. So if you're in a really tough neighborhood with lots of crime, that crime could spill over into the schools and make it much harder to provide a safe learning environment for students. There's also a large literature out there that suggests that in places where there's lots of urban decay, structural deterioration, that this can also influence safety in the schools. It can particularly influence students' perceptions of safety, right? So when they look around the neighborhood where the school is located and there's lots of vacant buildings, that this can signal to students that there's a lack of order in the area, and this can make them feel less safe. And so the issue here is that what may happen is that when charter schools set up shop, what they may do is just locate in the safer, less blighted sections of the city, and this is why they show higher safety in the descriptive studies. Then finally, the issue of self-selection bias. Now, this may be the most salient thing. So when you're in a city like Detroit, where both the public and the charter school sectors are serving a very high proportion of low-income African-American families, the public and charter schools can look pretty similar on paper, but it may be the case that the families that go out and seek out a school of choice are different in some ways. They may have certain advantages. So they may have a car, for example, that allows them to commute outside of the neighborhood to a school of choice. They may have the gas money to do that. They may have the motivation, or their commitment levels may be different than parents that don't seek out a school of choice. And so all of these things could confer an advantage to charter schools, right? And so that what you're actually seeing when you look at safety is that charter schools are taking in families that have these subtle advantages that don't come up in broad categories for race and class. So in this study, I asked the following questions. So, do charter schools exhibit higher perceived school safety than public schools, net of controls for student demographics, neighborhood crime, neighborhood structural vacancy rate, and also I used some proxies for self-selection. So I test the first hypothesis. So hypothesis 1. So charter schools will show higher perceived school safety, as the descriptive studies that are out there suggest, but that this relationship will decrease once you take into account differences in neighborhood crime and differences in structural vacancy rates. And then I also test the second hypothesis. So the relationship between charter schools and perceived school safety will decrease substantially after taking into account the attributes of school choosers or the attributes of parents in some way. And I have some proxy variables for this that I'll get to in subsequent slides. So I'll describe a little bit more about what I mean by that. Okay, so my dependent variable, my outcome of interest, was perceived school safety. This was a measure of 5 student-reported safety items. So it asked students how safe they felt in the school, in the bathrooms, in the hallways, and asked for students to give a rating based on these items. And this survey was administered by UChicago Impact, which is here at the University of Chicago. I think it's housed under the Urban Education Institute. Now, why would you care about perceived school safety? Well, first off, it's closely linked, been shown to be closely linked to mental health, socio-emotional development, attendance at school, student achievement, educational attainment, and then it's also been shown to be closely linked to things that are related to different aspects of safety. So things like bullying, school crime, and violence. So pretty important comprehensive measure. And particularly because if you look at something like school crime, even in some of the toughest schools, not all students will be a direct victim of a crime or may not observe crime, but all students will have a perception of safety that may be related to their outcomes in some way. And so some safety researchers have actually argued that perceived school safety is really one of the most important measures to look at when you're trying to assess safety in a school. So I brought together, to generate the control variables that I wanted to try and enable a more valid comparison between the public and charter schools, I brought together data from a number of other sources. So first I went to the Michigan Department of Education and I got school level student demographic data that I then linked back to schools in my sample. Now, I should also mention at the outset, all of the analyses in this study are at the school level. So all of the data have been aggregated to the school level. Then I went to the Detroit Police Department, and I got a data set of every single crime committed, major reported crime in the city over a 4-year period. And this data set, with really thousands of crimes, had the location of where the crime was reported. And so what I did with the location of the crime was then create a neighborhood indicator of crime that I then linked to schools in my data set. And also from these data, I extracted school crime and also violent crime in school. Then I went to a group called Data Driven Detroit, which is a nonprofit in Detroit which does a bunch of different data collections and lots of different research in the city of Detroit. And what they did, now keep in mind, Detroit is a city with about 78,000 vacant structures. And they went through and assessed every single building in the city and noted whether it was likely or very likely vacant. So using this data set, I created a neighborhood level measure of structural vacancy that I then mapped on to schools in the data set, or linked to schools in my data set. Then I wanted to get at this idea of selection, that somehow school choosers may have subtle differences that you wouldn't see in broad categories. And so I got this student commute distance variable. So basically what Data Driven Detroit did in conjunction with the Michigan Department of Education was that they found where students were living and then looked at where they were attending school and then calculated a commute distance for each student. So with this data, I was able to get a school average commute distance for every school in my data set. Now, why would this matter for selection? Well, first off, in Detroit, if you want to commute to a school of choice, it's almost always a family responsibility, meaning you have to get there on your own. A bus isn't going to come to your neighborhood to bring you to that school. So in a city where about a quarter of Detroiters don't actually own cars, that student commute distance, schools that are taking in students from far from around the city, may be taking in a relatively advantaged student population. That the families who, number one, have a car, have gas money to be able to commute to schools, and also to some extent maybe the motivation or commitment to want to go across town to attend a school of choice, that they may be different in some way. And so I controlled for this in my analyses. Then I also used a teacher-reported measure of parental involvement, also a composite, that was derived out of the same survey administered by UChicago Impact. And the idea with this is that even net of commute distance, it may be the case that charter schools are still taking in a relatively advantaged student population. And you might expect if charter schools are taking in the families who are the more motivated or the more committed families, and this is what's really the difference between charter and public schools, that they'll also report higher rates of parental involvement. Now, there's an important caveat to these proxies. So first off, they're not perfect proxies for selection in any way. So I'm hypothesizing that they're probably more related to parent characteristics, but they're also probably interrelated with school characteristics. So, for example, the school still has to be worth it in some way for the parent to want to commute to it. It still, at the very least, may have to present itself as being maybe a safe place to attend. And so the commute distance variable is probably in some way interrelated with school characteristics. And also the parental involvement variable. We know there's quite a bit of research out there that suggests charter schools try to do things to increase parental involvement. So that variable is also probably even more so related to school characteristics. And so the important limitation here is if these two variables are more related to school characteristics than they are related to attributes of parents, then I may be underestimating the influence of the school influences, rather. So I used two survey administrations, one in 2014 and one in 2015, and I averaged these together. Yeah?
Just to go back one slide, the question about, so data for distances, you're only able to see the average distance per given school or student population. You're not able to link back at the neighborhood where the student comes from, right?
Exactly.
And you're only using that average distance as a proxy for this commitment or motivation of like the population of parents that are sending their kids to preschool?
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly right, is that commute distance may be sort of a proxy for subtle parent advantages.
So if there's some students that live in a neighborhood that's really good, that happens to be right next to the school, and then there's some other families that live really far away and maybe less advantaged neighborhoods, then you wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two. And it's a very heterogeneous population in that sense, right?
I mean, yeah. So that's definitely a limitation in looking at school averages, because within schools there may be different dynamics going on when you look within the student body, and I'll talk a little bit about that particular limitation at the end of this, because it's an important one. But moving forward here, so I used two survey administrations that I averaged to enhance the reliability of the results. My final sample included 74% of Detroit schools, so it's about 150 schools. So what was left out? So you had a lot of highly specialized schools that didn't participate in the survey. So for example, special education public schools. There was some charter school for pregnant teens that didn't participate in the sample. There was a residential mental health charter, a couple of residential mental health charter schools that were left out. There was a group of about 6 Hispanic serving charter schools that are not in the sample. So the sample that I did have was primarily one that's more of your conventional schools, and some of these more highly specialized ones aren't in the sample. The final sample was included 87% of public schools, about 60% of charter schools. When you look across at the average student response rates for schools in the sample, is about 70%. And in the sample, schools are 88% African American and 82% economically disadvantaged, as classified by the state of Michigan. So very high rate of low-income African-American families in the sample. Just a quick note here. So I only looked at schools within Detroit, but there are about 17,000 students that go to schools in public and charter schools outside of the city of Detroit. And you may actually expect that in those cases, selection dynamics could even be more prominent. So I first want to look at my dependent variable, perceived school safety, and see how it correlated with some of the other safety-related variables. So if you look here, if you look at neighborhood crime and neighborhood structural vacancy rate, and you can see there's virtually no relationship there with perceived school safety. Now, there may be many reasons why you're seeing that result. It may just be the case that crime and structural vacancy are so pervasive and so uniform across the city that that's why there's not much of a relationship there. Then if you look at bullying, so just a quick note here, there's a strong positive relationship there. The reason for that is that in this case, the way this variable was computed, higher bullying indicates lower levels of bullying in the school. So that's why you see a strong positive relationship there, where you would expect to see a negative one. And then you can also see crime at school, violent crime at school, a fairly strong negative relationship with both of those there. Okay, so then I just did sort of just a comparison, really a descriptive comparison between charter and public schools on some of the variables of interest. So if you look at the top there, you see perceived school safety, and you can see charter schools, statistically higher perceived school safety, about a half a standard deviation higher. Of course, this is without any controls at this point. Then if you go down and look at the demographic differences, both types of schools, pretty high percentage of low-income African-American students. So if you look at the charter schools there, about 91%, the public schools about 86% in the sample. Then just moving down here to the school characteristics, you can see crime at school and violent crime at school. And you can see here statistically the public schools have much higher crime and violent crime in school relative to the charter schools. Then going to the neighborhood characteristics, so neighborhood crime and neighborhood vacancy rates. At least on average, what you can see here is that statistically there are no differences in neighborhood crime between the charter and public schools, and no statistical differences between charter and public schools in terms of the structural vacancy rate in the neighborhood. But if you look at these proxy variables that I'm using, so commute distance and parental involvement, you can see that charter schools have statistically higher commute distances, about 3.71 miles compared to about 2 miles in public schools. And they also have statistically higher parental involvement compared to the public schools.
Question. Just going back.
Yeah.
The economically disadvantaged indicator, remind us of, if you could, for me, please, of what that is. Because I see that the charter schools have the higher levels of disadvantage.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not surprised that some literature shows that charter schools serve more disadvantaged kids. But is that the disadvantage of the kids or the neighborhood, or what is that? Yeah, I know you said what it is.
Yeah, so it's classified by the state, and it's based off of whether they're eligible for free and reduced price lunch.
Okay.
So
it's an aggregate measure of the kids who attend the school, their poverty level.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yes.
So it is true then that charter schools have more disadvantaged kids, which is went the other way from what you said. That's not surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I think, no, it's not surprising. Although, as I move forward and break down the schools a little bit more, I think I'll get to that a little bit more in subsequent slides, because I think there are some important differences that are worth pointing out. But moving forward, so I ran a regression for predicting perceived school safety. So in the first model here on the left-hand side, so I used controls for school, demographic, and also the neighborhood characteristics, so the crime, structural vacancy rate variable. And you can see that charter schools have statistically much higher perceived school safety than the public schools in the model, so almost 0.7 of a standard deviation higher. That's a pretty big difference. Now, when I include these proxy variables, commute distance and parental involvement, into the second model, you can see this drops dramatically almost to zero. So at the very least, these commute distance variables and parental involvement, the commute distance and parental involvement variables seem to be in some way shedding light on selection, or at least may shed light on selection in some way. Okay, so looking at the results for commute distance and thinking about this a little bit more, and I started to look at student dispersion maps, started to look at achievement, started to look at the schools a little bit more closely. And what I ended up doing was realizing that what you really had was within the not only did you have charter and public schools, but you had neighborhood public schools and neighborhood charter schools, but you also had commuter charter and commuter public schools, and that they were kind of different in important ways. And so I ended up categorizing schools into neighborhood schools and commuter schools, where primary schools that were neighborhood schools had an average commute distance of less than 2.5 miles, and the secondary schools less than 3.5 miles. And so if you look right here at the top, so on one end you have your traditional neighborhood public schools. You can see the average commute distance there, 1.7 miles for primary, 2.8 miles for secondary. Now these schools tend to be very low income. So if you break out the economic disadvantage data, there's some research that's been done in Detroit that's done that. If you break that out, you can see that these schools tend to have the students, a greater proportion of students where their families earn between $0 and $5,000, for example. These schools have a greater proportion of families with less car ownership. These also tend to be the lowest performing schools in the district. So they include a lot of the state turnaround schools, for example. Then if you go to the neighborhood charter schools, so these schools also predominantly serve students in the surrounding neighborhood, right? So in this way, if you kind of look at neighborhood schools to each other, it's more of an apples to apples comparison if you think commute distance represents something important. And you can see these schools also tend to be relatively low performing. Now getting to this other set of schools, you have your commuter charter schools, and you can see commute distance, average commute distance spikes to about 4 miles for primary, about 5 miles for secondary. These tend to be your higher performing charter schools. These are the charter schools that some of them will put 90 or 100% of their students into post-secondary institutions. They oftentimes tend to be in newer and nicer buildings and facilities. And then finally, really at the top of, I kind of consider this a hierarchy of schools. At the top you have your selective, you have your commuter public schools. And so this includes a lot of your selective enrollment schools. So schools where you need a minimum grade point average to get in, where you may have to take a test or do an interview to get into the school. A lot of these schools enroll some of Detroit's most prominent families. And so these schools will have, you'll see later that these schools also have the lowest rate of economic disadvantage among all the different types of schools. They also have the highest average commute distance in the sample among the 4 types of schools. Now, I wanted to look at my categorization strategy a little bit more to make sure a neighborhood school was really a neighborhood school, that the majority of students lived around the neighborhood of the neighborhood school. And so I looked at student dispersion maps. So you can see here, the arrow here is pointing to the school. And this is so you have a map of Detroit. It's broken down by census tracts. Keep in mind, this is a city of about 143 square miles. It's a big city relative to a vastly reduced population. And this light blue area on the map here indicates that the school gets about less than 1% of its students from a given census tract. So what you can see here is that students are coming from all over the city to attend this school, coming from all over the place. So really good example of a commuter school. Now contrast this with a neighborhood school. And the darker shaded area there shows that more than 30% of students enrolled in the school are coming from that census tract. And you can see that the vast majority of students live right on top of the school. So this is kind of a good example of what a neighborhood school looks like in Detroit. So I wanted to do just kind of this comparison between the 2 types of neighborhood schools. So the neighborhood charters and the neighborhood public schools. And you can see here, once again, charters, higher perceived school safety, about a half a standard deviation higher, more than a half a standard deviation. And you can see pretty similar demographically, both very high rates of African American economically disadvantaged. Although you can see here, based on this state classification, the neighborhood charters actually report statistically higher rate there. Then if you look at school characteristics, crime at school, violent crime at school, statistically much higher in the public schools. Neighborhood crime and neighborhood vacancy rate, although it's much higher than the commuter schools in both cases, there's no statistical difference between the two types of neighborhood schools. And you can see here, student commute distance, parental involvement, there's no difference statistically between those two types of schools. Then I compared the commuter schools. So the commuter public and the commuter charter. Statistically, now this is a reduced sample, so statistically no difference there between the charter and public schools, but the charter schools are still reporting higher, although it's not a statistical difference. You can see both schools, very high percentage of African American students in the sample. And then economic disadvantage, you can see here the commuter public schools, which include a lot of the really elite selective enrollment schools, the few elite selective enrollment schools that are in Detroit. You can see the economic disadvantage rate, although still pretty high, is the lowest in the sample. But they do still have statistically higher crime and violent crime in school in the commuter publics. And then looking at neighborhood crime and vacancy rate, no statistical differences between the two types of schools. So it doesn't, at least no matter how you break down the data, at least with these data, it doesn't appear to be the case that charter schools are disproportionately locating in safer, less blighted sections of the city. Then if you look at commute distance and parental involvement, no statistical differences between the two types of schools. So in running a regression with these four types of schools, the neighborhood public, neighborhood charter, and commuter public, you may be able to do a little bit more of an insightful comparison of schools. So that's what I did. So I ran a regression with the four types of schools. Now, in this model, the reference category is neighborhood public schools. And you can see here, relative to the neighborhood public schools, in the first model with all of the controls, that all the other three types of schools, much higher perceived school safety. You can see the commuter charters are really up there. Big difference between your neighborhood publics, between these and your neighborhood public schools. Now keep in mind, these schools are already broken down by commute distance. So in Model 2, I add in my parental involvement variable. You can see now the relationship drops quite a bit, although there's still higher perceived school safety in both of the commuter schools, about a quarter of a standard deviation higher. And with the neighborhood charter schools, no matter what I threw at them, they kind of maintain statistical significance. And so they're still about half a standard deviation higher than the neighborhood public schools. Okay, so now given all of the talk with choice, especially in tough cities like Detroit, related to safety, that charter schools are going to provide safer schools, I wanted to kind of understand this result for neighborhood charter schools and neighborhood public schools a little bit more. So I looked at all of the below average neighborhood public schools. So all of the neighborhood public schools that were reporting below average perceived school safety. So they're here in this bar chart, and you can see they're about a full standard deviation below the mean for the below average neighborhood public schools. There's 30, keep in mind too, there's just 32 of them that I'm looking at. I'm trying to get a better sense of what's going on here. So I asked, okay, so if you're in one of these schools and you went to your, and you wanted to go to your closest charter school. So let's just take your nearest charter school. Could you improve your safety? And you can see here, the closest charters get right back to the mean. So it looks like you can improve your safety quite a bit, at least in the case of these 32 schools. So then I wanted to look at also with the charters to see, okay, how about the below average charters? And there were 12 of them. If you were in one of these below average charters, could you get to a safer public school if you went to your closest public school? And you can see they're pretty similar, actually, not much of a difference there. Okay, so a summary of the results. So it seems to be the case that charter schools show higher perceived school safety until you take into account student commute distance and parental involvement, and then that relationship drops quite a bit. And maybe suggests that there is some selection going on there. However, neighborhood charter schools seem to be the exception to the trend, that even when you included these proxies for selection, they were still higher on perceived school safety. Now, neighborhood crime and vacancy rate were pretty much structural vacancy rate rather, were pretty much unrelated to perceived school safety in all of the analyses. And again, there may be various reasons for this. I think one of the main ones is probably that even if you're in one of the few neighborhoods where there's less structural vacancy or a little bit less crime, you're always in Detroit really close to a neighborhood that has a lot of structural vacancy and a lot of crime. So it seems to be the case, if you look at some of the data on Detroit, that crime is pretty pervasive throughout the city, and urban decay is also pretty pervasive as well. It's also worth noting that now some of this is starting to change. The city has started to experience a revitalization in its downtown, so starting to improve neighborhoods, and so maybe these data would change and look a little bit more like what you see in Chicago, where you do see big neighborhood effects being related to safety in schools, because the neighborhoods seem to be a little bit more stratified than what you see in Detroit. Okay, so there are some important limitations to this study. And I'm just going to focus in on 4 of them. So first off, Detroit is just one city. I looked at a fairly modest set of schools, so or a fairly modest number of schools, so just 150 schools. So these relationships would need to be checked elsewhere to see how the results that I'm presenting hold up in other work. Also, I couldn't rule out selection bias. So I had that result for neighborhood charter schools, but there may be other selection dynamics at play. Maybe it has something to do with the social network of school choosers. There could be a whole range of factors going on there, and I'm not able to rule out selection bias. So that's just a limitation when looking at these relationships. Also, in this study, I kind of assume that parental involvement is behind safety. But it may be the case that the relationship works in the other direction. So if you provide a safer school, maybe that encourages more parents to participate. So this is actually something I'm working on now I'm using some national level data to try to tease out the causal direction of that relationship, because I think it might be an important one, actually. Also, now this 4th point here, and I think this is important from a systems level when trying to think about, okay, does charter school improve safety in this? Do charter schools improve safety in the system? So I don't examine whether safety declines. So when students leave the neighborhood public school for a charter school. So when a bunch of students maybe go to your a charter school, does safety actually go down in the neighborhood public school? Does it stay the same? Does it improve? Now, some people have suggested that choice is going to be a rising tide that lifts all boats. So maybe some people would expect that neighborhood public schools will feel the competition and they'll be forced to become safer. I don't look at any of this in this study. So the overall results seem to suggest that there's a mix of parent and school characteristics behind higher perceived school safety in charter schools. Now, I did subsequent qualitative work. So I did semi-structured interviews with 33 parents in charter and public schools, 21 teachers in charter and public schools. I did a bunch of school tours. I did numerous informal interviews with police officers, security guards, local officials. I observed student commutes at about 50 different schools. So this qualitative work seemed to suggest or seemed to support this interpretation that it's a mix of school and parent attributes that are at play when looking at higher perceived schools, or when you have this finding higher perceived school safety in charter schools. So is the promise of safer schools fulfilled? Well, on the one hand, it may be that charter schools may provide safer options for a greater number of low-income minority families that wouldn't have otherwise had them. But at the same time, it seems to be the case that charter schools kind of deepen sorting of families into a hierarchy of schools. And so overall, it seems to be that charter schools offer an improvement on perceived school safety, but may not serve the most vulnerable or the most highly disadvantaged students that you really find in the neighborhood public schools, where they sort of have the highest proportion of earners who earn between, say, $0 and $5,000 a year, or the highest percentage of students who are homeless or maybe in a state of semi-homelessness. They don't tend to make good school choosers on average, or even be able to be school choosers. So I'd like to try to address some of these limitations in this study, in future work. So right now I've just started to work with a data set in New York City, and I'm looking at 10 years of student-reported data, looking at not only school crime, but also student-reported perceived school safety, and a bunch of other different variables. So thousands of schools and thousands of students in the survey over 10 years. And my hope is to try to determine whether safety actually declines in public schools when they leave for charter schools. Because I'll have, with this data set, I now have individual level data, and so I'll be looking at this. And I also, of course, with the individual level data, would like to understand individual level trends within schools. So in this study, I just look at school level trends. And so what's happening within schools may be really important, and so I'll be looking at that. And then finally, to examine changes in safety. So if you're in a public school and you report your safety in one year and then you transfer to a charter school in the next year, how does your safety change? And then in the other direction too, if you're in a charter school and you report safety in one year and then move to the public sector, how does your safety change? What does that look like? So that's some of the work that I'm doing in the coming year. Okay, thank you very much.